Nothing about that moment felt special, no warning. No tension you could point to, just the low, constant hum of engines cutting through open sky. Passengers were settled into that strange in-between state, not fully alert, not fully relaxed. Some staring out the windows, watching clouds drift by like slow-moving thoughts. Others scrolling aimlessly, killing time until landing. It was the kind of flight people forget the moment they step off the plane. The kind where nothing becomes a story later. Chuck Norris sat quietly, strapped in, posture calm, not scanning the cabin. Not watching anyone, just present. There's a difference between looking relaxed and being relaxed. Most people on that flight were distracted, he was aware. The cabin lights reflected softly off the windows, overhead bins were shut. Flight attendants moved down the aisle with practiced ease, unaware that this calm was fragile. Because calm doesn't announce when it's about to end. It just breaks. A slight vibration ran through the aircraft, so minor that most people didn't even look up. Turbulence happens. Everyone knows that. But this wasn't turbulence. It didn't come from the sky. Chuck felt it before he fully registered it. A shift that didn't match the rhythm of the plane. Something human. Something intentional. Across the cabin, a voice rose, not loud enough to alarm, but sharp enough to cut through the background noise. A movement followed. Fast, unsteady. People noticed, but not enough to act. That's how moments like this work. Your brain wants reassurance before it accepts danger. A man stood halfway down the aisle. Too tense, too focused. Still, most passengers stayed seated. Nobody wants to be the first to overact. Nobody wants to be wrong. Chuck didn't stand yet. He didn't need to. He watched the way the man shifted his weight. The way his balance didn't match the aircraft's motion. The way his hands kept adjusting, as if testing something invisible. This wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was preparation. Chuck's breathing stayed slow, heart rate steady, not because he didn't understand the risk, but because he did. An airplane isn't a room. It's a narrow tube of metal suspended in open air. Every movement affects everything else. There are no safe distances, no solid ground to recover on, no room for mistakes. Around them, life went on normally. A child laughed a few rows back. Someone dropped a magazine. The engines droned on, indifferent. That's the part people never talk about. How danger often shows up while everything else stays ordinary. Chuck finally unbuckled his seatbelt. Not quickly, not dramatically. Slow enough that no one noticed. Careful enough not to draw attention. He stood steadying himself as the plane gently shifted course. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about fighting. He was thinking about balance, timing, control. Because whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to happen on the ground. And once it started, onhami viliati angi eraundi no ufiels nermo hidduo yomoti moment intermedios hanji. The sound came again. This time no one could ignore it. Not loud enough to be an explosion, not violent enough to be panic yet, just sharp, out of place. It cut through the steady rhythm of the engines like a scratch on vinyl. A few heads turned, someone frowned. Another person paused their video, pulling out one earbud. Still no alarms, no instructions from the crew. That silence was almost worse. The man in the eyes moved again. This time faster, too fast for a cramped cabin. His shoulder clipped the armrest of an aisle seat. A passenger flinched, instinctively pulling back. The man didn't apologize, didn't even look. That's when the energy shifted. People didn't panic yet, but they noticed. You could feel it in the way bodies stiffened, in the way conversations died mid-sentence, in the sudden awareness of how close everyone was to everyone else. An airplane doesn't give you space to be uncertain. Every movement feels closer than it should. A flight attendant took a step forward, not aggressively, just enough to signal attention. "Sir," the word barely left her mouth before the man turned. His eyes weren't wild, they were locked. Focused. That was the moment some people realized this wasn't just a disturbance. The man said something low, fast, impossible to fully catch. Not a shout, not a threat, but his tone carried weight. Passengers leaned away instinctively. A mother pulled her child closer. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" No one answered. The plane shifted slightly, banking into its path, a normal adjustment, but now every movement felt amplified. The man braced himself against a seatback, not for balance, but like someone preparing to move against motion. That's when Chuck stepped into the aisle. Still no rush, still no urgency in his face, but the distance between them closed. The man noticed. You could see it in the way his posture changed, how his shoulders squared, how his breathing sharpened. Whatever he'd been preparing for, he hadn't expected resistance. Not here, not now. The isle suddenly felt smaller, too narrow for two opposing intentions. Passengers started standing halfway out of their seats, unsure whether to flee or freeze. There was nowhere to go anyway. Someone dropped a bag. It hit the floor with a dull thud that sounded louder than it should have. The man's hand moved, not all at once, just enough to test reaction. Chuck didn't mirror it, didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his stance, feet placed carefully, knees loose, center of gravity low. Anyone watching closely would have noticed something strange. There was no anger in him, no adrenaline-fueled tension, just readiness. The flight attendant backed away. Slowly, smartly, the man took a step forward. The plane hit a pocket of light turbulence at the exact same time. The timing was terrible. Passengers gasped as the cabin dipped. Overhead bins rattled, someone screamed. The man lost balance for half a second. Half a second is nothing on the ground. In the air, it's everything. Chuck moved, not to strike, but to intercept. Hands met arms, momentum met control. The struggle wasn't loud, no dramatic crash, no flying punches, just two forces colliding in a space that could barely contain one. The isle bent around them, elbows brushing seats, shoulders grazing headrests. Passengers pressed back as far as they could, hearts pounding. The man tried to overpower. Chuck redirected. The plane shuddered again. A sharper drop this time. Gravity shifted. For a split second, nobody was fully grounded. That's when fear finally arrived. Not screaming panic, but raw, cold realization. If this goes wrong, there is no recovery. The man lunged again, desperation creeping into his movement now. Whatever control he thought he had was slipping. Chuck tightened his grip, not forceful, precise, every motion accounted for, every step calculated around the aircraft's movement. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some covered their mouths, others couldn't look away. This wasn't entertainment. This was survival unfolding in real time. The engines roared on, indifferent. The sky outside stayed calm, almost mocking. Inside the cabin, time stretched, seconds felt like minutes. And in that suspended moment, with the plane moving, gravity shifting and no room for everything balanced on one outcome, next. At first glance, nothing new happened, no sudden weapon, no shocking reveal, no announcement from the cockpit. And yet, everything felt heavier. That's how escalation really works, not by adding danger, but by realizing how much danger was already there. The cabin hadn't changed. The isle was still narrow, seats still bolted to the floor, the sky outside still calm and distant. But perception shifted. People weren't just watching a struggle anymore. They were starting to understand the consequences. This wasn't about who was stronger. It wasn't even about who would win. It was about what losing control would mean in a place where control is everything. Every sway of the plane now felt intentional. Every vibration felt closer, louder. Passengers began replaying what they'd seen just seconds earlier. The man's focus, the way he moved before anything went wrong. This wasn't random. That realization alone raised the stakes. Chuck felt it too, not as fear but as clarity. Because once intent is recognized, hesitation becomes the real danger. He adjusted again, subtly, a foot repositioned, a shoulder angled differently. Small changes that meant everything. The man tried to break free, not with panic now, but frustration. That frustration translated into force. Force is simple, control is not. The plane rolled gently to one side, correcting its course. On the ground, no one would notice. In the aisle, it changed everything. Balance became temporary, leverage became unstable. Chuck didn't fight the movement, he used it. That's what most people miss when they imagine conflict. They think in straight lines, forward, back. But this wasn't a straight line environment. Here, gravity was negotiable, momentum was borrowed, and the floor itself was untrustworthy. The man pushed harder, trying to end it quickly. That urgency gave him away. Urgency narrows options. Precision expands them. Passengers felt the shift even if they couldn't explain it. The fear changed texture. Earlier it was confusion. Now it was understanding. They understood that this moment wasn't loud because it couldn't be. Noise would mean loss of control, and loss of control would mean disaster. Chuck kept his voice low, not commanding, not threatening, grounding. It wasn't meant for the man alone. It was meant for the space around them. Because escalation isn't always about doing more. Sometimes it's about preventing everything from becoming worse. The man's movements grew sharper, less calculated, more emotional. That imbalance mattered. Chuck tightened his positioning, not his grip. He reduced angles, limited range. He wasn't trying to overpower. He was trying to contain. That difference is invisible to most people, but it changes outcomes. A sudden drop, brief but noticeable. The plane corrected itself quickly, but the cabin reacted all at once. Gasps, hands gripping armrests. Someone whispered a prayer without realizing it. This wasn't turbulence anymore, it was context. Now everyone understood what was at stake. The man stumbled as gravity shifted again. Not enough to fall, enough to lose certainty. Certainty is fragile. Once it cracks, everything speeds up. Chuck stepped closer, closing the last bit of space. Not rushing, ending options. That's escalation through interpretation. Nothing new introduced, just fewer ways out. The man realized it too. You could see it in his eyes. This wasn't going his way, and desperation doesn't stay quiet for long. Passengers leaned back as far as the seats allowed, as if distance could help now. Time stretched again, moments layered on top of moments. And in that compressed space, with the plane steady, the cabin silent, and everyone holding their breath, it became clear that whatever happened next wouldn't be reversible. Not because of drama, not because of spectacle, but because once escalation reaches this point, there is no return to normal. This was the moment no one else could see, not the struggle, not the tension in the aisle. The decision underneath it all. Chuck could feel the plane's rhythm through the soles of his feet. Every vibration translated into information, speed, direction, stability. On the surface, everything looked controlled, but inside, calculation was happening fast, not emotional, not impulsive, precise. Because there were two risks now, the man in front of him and the possibility of doing too much. Most people think danger only comes from inaction, but action carries its own cost. A wrong move here wouldn't just end the struggle, it would send bodies into seats, trigger panic, multiply chaos. Chuck knew that, and that knowledge weighed heavier than fear ever could. He could end this quickly. The skill was there, the instinct was there. But speed wasn't the answer. Restraint was. He felt the man's breathing, sharp and even accelerating. Emotion was taking over. That made him unpredictable. Unpredictability is dangerous in tight spaces. Chuck slowed himself even more. That choice went against instinct, against adrenaline. It takes discipline to resist escalation when everything in your body tells you to finish it. The plane shifted again, small correction, nothing more. Still, Chuck adjusted instantly. He was balancing not just himself, but the outcome. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about ending something without creating something worse. The man pulled again, harder now. Frustration leaked into panic. Panic spreads, even silent panic. Chuck felt eyes on him, not judging, depending. Passengers weren't thinking about strength anymore. They were thinking about safety, and whether the person standing there understood that responsibility. Chuck remembered something, not as a memory, but as a principle. Control first, force last. He adjusted his grip again, minimized movement, reduced leverage, not to hurt, to limit. The man tried to shift sideways. The aisle fought him. Seats pressed in. Armrests scraped fabric. Every sound felt louder now, every movement felt final. Chuck's mind stayed quiet. That's the part most people misunderstand. Clarity doesn't feel loud. It feels narrow. There was only one question that mattered now, not whether he could stop this, but how to do it without turning fear into panic. He felt the man hesitate, just a fraction. That hesitation wasn't weakness. It was doubt. Doubt opened space. Chuck used that space carefully. He didn't rush it. He didn't exploit it violently. He contained it. Because the real conflict wasn't happening in the aisle. It was happening in that thin line between decisive action and irreversible consequence. And once that line is crossed, there's no stepping back. The moment didn't announce itself, no countdown, no dramatic pause. It arrived quietly the instant when hesitation stopped being an option. The man's breathing changed again, not faster this time, deeper, measured in a way that signaled a decision had already been made. That was the shift. Up until now, everything had existed in a fragile balance, control versus chaos, containment versus collapse. Now that balance was gone. The plane adjusted its altitude slightly, routine, automated, invisible to anyone not paying attention. But inside the cabin, it felt like the floor slid sideways for just a heartbeat. That heartbeat mattered. The man used it, not with precision, with commitment. His weight came forward all at once, no testing, no hesitation. This wasn't escalation anymore. This was conclusion. Chuck felt it immediately. The difference between resistance and intent. There was no room left to de-escalate through patience. No space to wait for fatigue or fear to do the work. Waiting now would be the mistake. Time compressed, sounds dulled. The cabin seemed to narrow even further, as if the walls themselves were listening. Chuck didn't think in words, he thought in outcomes. If this continued for even a few more seconds, someone would lose balance, a seat would give way. Panic would spread faster than gravity. This was the last clean moment. He shifted his stance, not forward, not backward, but down, lower center, wider base. The move was subtle enough that most passengers wouldn't notice it later if asked. But it changed everything. The man pushed again, harder, desperate now. That desperation sealed it. Chuck acted, not explosively, not dramatically, decisively. He redirected force instead of meeting it, used the narrowness of the eisel against excess movement, turned imbalance into stillness. The plane shuddered once more, a brief ripple through the cabin, passengers gasped in unison, then nothing. The sudden absence of motion felt louder than the struggle had. The man was no longer advancing, no longer pressing, he was contained. Not defeated, contained. That distinction mattered. Because containment kept the cabin calm, kept fear from igniting, kept the moment from becoming a disaster story instead of a close call. Chuck held position, didn't rush to finish anything, didn't relax too soon. Points of no return don't end immediately, they stabilize slowly. Flight attendants waited, passengers stayed frozen, unsure whether it was safe to breathe normally again. The engines droned on unchanged, the sky outside remained indifferent. Life continued, but on a slightly different path than it had been moments earlier. Only later would people realize how thin that line had been, how close everything came to tipping the wrong way. Because the point of no return isn't the moment things explode. It's the moment someone chooses that they won't. For a few seconds no one moved, not because they were told not to, but because their bodies hadn't caught up to what just happened. The eisel was still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, like the air itself is waiting for permission to relax. Chuck maintained his position, not tightening, not loosening, holding the situation exactly where it needed to be. This was the part people misunderstand the most. They think resolution is a single moment, a move, an end. But real resolution is a process. The man's resistance faded unevenly, not all at once, small releases, tiny shifts where tension drained out of muscle and posture. Chuck felt each one. He didn't rush it, because letting go too early can undo everything. The plane leveled out completely now, settling into smooth air. The floor stopped arguing with gravity. The cabin stopped creaking. That change alone altered the atmosphere. Fear doesn't vanish instantly. It loosens its grip when the environment tells it to. Passengers began to breathe again, not deeply, not confidently, but enough to remind themselves they were still safe. A flight attendant approached carefully, not panicked, trained. Her voice stayed low, measured. She didn't ask questions that needed answers right away. She focused on procedure, on restoring order without stirring emotion. That mattered, because chaos feeds on attention. Chuck shifted slightly, allowing assistance without surrendering control, a quiet exchange of looks, an understanding without words. The man was guided, not dragged, moved, not thrown. Every step taken deliberately, as if the entire cabin were balancing on invisible glass. Passengers watched in silence, some in shock, some in disbelief, some already rewriting the moment in their minds, trying to make sense of it. The eisel cleared. Seats returned to being just seats again. Normalcy crept back in cautiously. A child asked a question too quietly to hear. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped. Another person wiped their hands on their jeans, realizing only now that they'd been shaking. Chuck returned to his seat without ceremony. No acknowledgement, no reaction. He buckled in as if nothing unusual had occurred. That contrast was unsettling to some, comforting to others, because it reframed the moment. If the person who had acted wasn't shaken, maybe the danger really was over. The flight continued. No emergency landing, no dramatic announcement. Just a calm voice from the cockpit reassuring everyone that the situation was under control. That sentence carried weight now. Under control. Not because nothing happened, but because it had been handled. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in what doesn't happen afterward. No panic wave, no stampede, no escalation, just a shared understanding that something serious had been avoided. Chuck sat still, eyes forward, his breathing steady. Inside, there was no celebration, no relief flooding in, just completion. Because for him, the moment had already passed. The consequence had already been decided. The rest of the flight unfolded normally, drinks served, lights dimmed. People resumed their private worlds. But underneath that normalcy, a subtle shift lingered. Everyone on that plane knew, even if they couldn't fully articulate it, that they had crossed a moment where things could have gone very differently. And they hadn't, not because of luck, not because of chance, but because control had been chosen over chaos. The plane landed without further incident. Engines quieted, passengers exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for hours. Chuck remained seated, hands folded calmly in his lap, no applause. No recognition, just the quiet assessment of what had transpired. Moments like these don't always demand noise. They demand thought, reflection. Passengers began gathering their belongings. Conversations resumed cautiously, voices low. Eyes darted occasionally toward the aisle, as if expecting the unexpected to return. Chuck watched them, not with judgment, not with detachment. Awareness lingered. Because even when chaos stops, its effects ripple. He considered the man, still being escorted quietly by crew and security. No dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation. The situation had resolved, but the imprint remained. The narrowness of the aisle, the shift in gravity, the tension in human reaction. Those were things that couldn't be erased. Chuck allowed himself a subtle exhale, not relief, not celebration, just acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the challenge had passed, that the stakes had been real, that he had been tested in a space that offered no margin for error. Outside the plane, the sun was setting, orange light spilling over the tarmac. Passengers emerged into normal life again, oblivious to how close things had come to breaking. Chuck walked down the jetway slowly, every step measured, every movement deliberate. He thought of the few seconds where decision and hesitation collided, where control and chaos met, where the narrowest margin had determined the outcome. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was mastery of circumstance, discipline under pressure, clarity when it mattered most. As the crowd dispersed, a flight attendant approached briefly. "You handled it well," she said softly. No exaggeration, no dramatics, just honesty. Chuck nodded, acknowledging the truth without comment. Later, in quiet reflection, he replayed the moment internally. Every movement, every decision, every microsecond where failure could have erupted. He didn't dwell on fear, he examined choice, measured consequence, anticipated reaction. Because that's what experience does. It takes danger and translates it into knowledge, not pride, not glory, just understanding. Passengers would tell their stories differently. Some would exaggerate. Some would forget details entirely. Chuck didn't need the narrative. He didn't need their eyes or applause. He needed the truth of the moment. The quiet aftermath. The stillness that followed the storm. And as he walked into the terminal, a single thought remained: control doesn't always demand action. Sometimes it demands patience. You fake heroes. By the time Chuck exited the terminal, the world had returned to its usual rhythm. Cars honked. People moved quickly past one another. Announcements over the loudspeakers blended into white noise. But inside him, nothing had returned to normal. The moment in the air lingered, not as fear, not as excitement, but as a reminder of what could happen when precision meets unpredictability. He moved through the crowd deliberately, no rush, no pause, just observation. Passengers from the flight were scattered around, many unaware of the narrow margin that had kept them safe. Some were replaying events internally. Some had already moved on. Life continued, indifferent. Chuck didn't seek recognition. There was no public display, no narrative of heroics. He understood that true resolution rarely announces itself. The man responsible for the disruption had been escorted quietly by authorities. No spectacle, no dramatics, no opportunity for panic to replay. Chuck paused outside the terminal for a moment. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint noise of distant traffic, a subtle reminder that chaos could emerge anywhere, and calm could exist even in the same space. He reflected briefly on control, on timing, on restraint. All the tools had worked, not through force alone, but through anticipation and understanding. Passengers would remember pieces differently. Some exaggerated, some minimized, but for Chuck it didn't matter. The quiet resolution wasn't about validation, it wasn't about proving skill, it was about ensuring that the chain of events ended safely. Even now, in the mundane rhythm of the world outside the terminal, the lesson remained clear. Moments of high stakes can pass unnoticed by everyone else, and those who act must remain unseen. Measured calm. He walked toward his car, each step deliberate. The city lights reflected softly on the pavement. The tension from the flight slowly ebbed, leaving a steady awareness behind. Chuck allowed himself one small thought. Everything had ended without harm. No chaos remained, no drama lingered, just the quiet aftermath of decisive action. And in that quiet, a single, unspoken question hovered in the air. UVNHIMES SHIO DOEUSUEO HIRIELU MATRUD.